Pam Bondi was seated across from Senator John Kennedy, and even before she said a single word, there was a heavy tension in the room that viewers could feel instantly. This was not a routine Senate exchange or a rehearsed political moment. What Kennedy was preparing to deliver was far more serious. It was a warning that the system Americans depend on for safety, stability, and national unity may be nearing a dangerous tipping point, one that many people never thought they would witness in their lifetime. And he did not hint at it quietly. He laid it out plainly, directly, and publicly, for the entire country to hear. Kennedy began with a single, powerful concept: legitimacy. He tied it directly to chaos, arguing that when legitimacy collapses, the social contract between the government and the people is broken. He then pivoted to examples meant to drive that point home. He asked Bondi if she remembered Michael Avenatti. She acknowledged she did. Kennedy reminded the room that just a few years earlier, Avenatti was a constant presence in Washington media. He was celebrated by large parts of the press, appeared on television almost daily, and was treated like a political celebrity. Largely because of his aggressive attacks on Donald Trump, Kennedy emphasized how often Avenatti was on CNN, joking that he seemed to appear more than Wolf Blitzer himself. Then Kennedy asked the obvious question, "Where is Michael Avenatti now?" Bondi responded that he is sitting in prison. Kennedy followed up bluntly, stating that Avenatti was a criminal and that the Department of Justice helped put him behind bars. Bondi agreed. The point was clear. When the system works, justice is applied. Regardless of media attention or political alignment, Kennedy then moved to another high-profile case, asking Bondi if she remembered Sam Bankman-Fried. She did. Kennedy referred to him as the so-called boy genius, someone portrayed as incredibly smart, wealthy, and powerful. He described how Bankman-Fried believed he could control outcomes, influence institutions, and walk into meetings with world leaders like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair while dressing sloppily, acting as if the rules simply did not apply to him. Kennedy mocked the image, saying Bankman-Fried seemed to think the persona was charming or clever. Again, Kennedy asked the same question: where is he now? Bondi answered that Bankman-Fried is also in prison, adding that she had even seen his story covered in documentaries. Kennedy stated plainly that Bankman-Fried was a criminal as well. And once again, the Department of Justice played a role in holding him accountable. Kennedy then shifted the conversation to a broader truth. He asked Bondi if they could agree that there are many honorable, hardworking people within the Department of Justice. Bondi strongly agreed, emphasizing that countless DOJ employees and law enforcement officers risk their lives every single day to protect the public. She acknowledged their dedication, service, and sacrifice, but Kennedy wasn't finished. He pressed further, asking whether it was also fair to say that there have been, and may still be, some bad actors within the Department of Justice. Bondi agreed again, noting that for years much of the department's internal operations were hidden from public view. She stated that while the majority serve with integrity, a small minority may have damaged public trust. And according to her, that minority has played a role in weakening the legitimacy of America's criminal justice system, an outcome that carries serious consequences for the entire country. Senator Kennedy then described what he believed was the most destabilizing action he had witnessed over the past 4 years, possibly even in the entire history of the Department of Justice. In his view, the moment Attorney General Merrick Garland chose to criminally prosecute a former president of the United States marked a dangerous turning point. Kennedy argued that the decision was based on questionable facts and untested legal theories. But what made it even more alarming, he said, was the timing. Garland moved forward only after that former president had officially announced he was running for office again, directly against Garland's own boss. Kennedy made it clear what he believed this amounted to. He asked bluntly whether this looked like the government going after a political opponent. Bondi acknowledged the concern. Kennedy clarified that this was his personal opinion, but he emphasized that such a move was not accidental. According to him, decisions like that require planning. He stressed that this kind of action had never happened before in the United States. He said it resembled behavior seen in unstable countries, not in a nation built on constitutional norms and legal restraint. Kennedy explained why he believed the decision was so damaging. In his words, it broke the seal. Once that line was crossed, the act became normalized. He warned that America is full of ambitious prosecutors from both political parties. And once precedent is set, others may feel justified doing the same thing in reverse. He suggested that somewhere in the country, a prosecutor could already be considering criminal charges against President Biden's inner circle, accusing them of conspiring to hide his mental decline. Kennedy said that this is the dangerous road the country is now heading down. He then turned directly to Bondi with a challenge. He told her the situation must be fixed. In his view, restoring trust requires identifying the bad actors within the Department of Justice and removing them. At the same time, the good people, the ones who follow the law honestly and fairly, should be supported and elevated. He stressed that all decisions must be grounded in facts, evidence, and fairness, not revenge or politics. Kennedy warned against a powerful temptation. Some people, he said, will argue that while two wrongs do not make a right, they do make things even. He urged Bondi to resist that thinking. Retaliation would only deepen the damage. What the country truly needs, he argued, is the restoration of legitimacy within the Department of Justice. He closed by making one point unmistakably clear. This is not about politics, party loyalty, or personal grudges. It is about legitimacy, the one thing every powerful institution must have in order to survive. Kennedy did not shout or dramatize his message. He spoke calmly and asked straightforward questions. But those questions were powerful enough to make people stop what they were doing and listen. Behind each question was a concern many Americans already feel but rarely say out loud. If the justice system loses legitimacy, what happens next? If people no longer believe the rules are fair, what fills that void? If prosecutors are viewed as political weapons instead of guardians of the law, who can the public trust? Kennedy was not exaggerating or spreading fear. He was giving voice to a reality millions sense instinctively. When the system starts picking sides, law and order do not survive, and neither does public faith in justice. What Kennedy described next felt like the beginning of a free fall. And this was only the opening minute of his message. His real argument was not about one bad decision or one controversial case. It was about a growing pattern, one that, if ignored, could permanently change the country. Before he even mentioned famous names, scandals, or powerful figures who had collapsed, he made sure everyone understood what was truly at risk. Not policies, not elections. Stability itself. The kind of stability people take for granted until it starts slipping through their fingers. Kennedy painted a clear picture of two very different Americas. In one, the justice system remains strong, independent, and respected. In the other, people stop listening. They stop obeying. They stop believing the rules apply equally. History shows what happens next. Once the public believes the system is rigged, everything else begins to crack. Trust disappears. Respect fades. Compliance weakens. Unity collapses. When legitimacy is gone, the damage spreads fast and deep. By the time Kennedy paused, the room felt noticeably different. It was the kind of silence that only happens when people realize the issue goes beyond personalities, headlines, or viral scandals. This was about institutions, about what keeps a nation functioning, and about what happens when the glue holding everything together begins to dissolve. The conversation was no longer theoretical. The moment Kennedy moved from abstract warnings to real-world examples, it became impossible to ignore. He asked Bondi if she remembered a man who once dominated cable news. A man who appeared on television so often he felt like a permanent fixture. He was not an elected official, yet he spoke like one. He was not a judge, yet he acted as if courtrooms answered to him. Reporters praised him. Networks elevated him. Viewers were led to believe he was untouchable. But attention does not erase fraud. And fame does not protect anyone from consequences. When Kennedy asked where that man was now, Bondi barely needed to answer. Everyone already knew. Not on magazine covers. not giving speeches, not trending online. He was behind bars, sitting in a prison cell because the L'Oreal law, legitimate law, finally caught up to him. It was a reminder that the justice system can still work when it is allowed to. Even when media hype tries to crown someone as immune, legitimacy can cut through the illusion. And when it does, the fall is harshed. That then Kennedy brought up another name. One connected to massive wealth, crypto empires, celebrity endorsements, and political access. A man once treated as a financial prodigy. Someone who walked into meetings with world leaders dressed casually because he believed reputation mattered more than respect. He was praised as a visionary until the moment the mask slipped and billions vanished almost overnight. And where is he now? Not at galas. Not on conference stages. Not shaping the future. In prison. That was the point Kennedy was driving home. These were not political victories. They were not culture war trophies. They were warnings. Proof that legitimacy still matters, that accountability still exists, and that when the justice system works properly, no amount of fame, money, or influence can fully shield someone from the truth. They were warnings that ego, fame, and influence collapse quickly once the law steps in. But Kennedy was not celebrating those downfalls. He was using them to make a much deeper and more serious point. If the justice system can methodically and precisely dismantle celebrity fraudsters, why does it suddenly appear reckless, inconsistent, or suspicious when it comes to politically sensitive cases? Why does it operate with surgical precision in one moment, then swing with brute force in another? That contradiction was at the center of Kennedy's argument. He explained that a justice system cannot survive if the public believes it has two faces. One face for the powerful and well-connected, and another for everyone else. One standard for sensational fraud cases and a completely different standard for political battles. A system that follows the rulebook when it is convenient, but rewrites the rules when the stakes become political. Kennedy made clear that this is not just unfair, it is dangerous. Once people believe prosecutions are driven by agendas instead of evidence, the foundation of law itself begins to crack. When that belief takes hold, consequences are no longer viewed as justice. They are seen as retaliation. And that is when real chaos starts, not the dramatic kind shown in movies, but the slow, quiet erosion of trust in every institution meant to hold society together. Courts lose credibility. Law enforcement loses authority. And the public starts to disengage, not because they are lawless, but because they no longer believe the system is honest. Kennedy stressed that his concern was not about isolated mistakes. It was about crossing a line that, in his view, had never been crossed in American history. Once broken, that line cannot simply be patched back together. He described a moment when prosecutors appeared to make choices, more commonly associated with countries lacking strong institutions. Legal theories seemed untested. Evidence appeared questionable. Timing raised serious concerns. Political calendars and courtroom decisions suddenly overlapped in ways that made even neutral observers uneasy. But Kennedy said the most dangerous part was not the decision itself. It was what that decision unlocked. In his words, it broke the seal. Once one side sees prosecution used against political opponents, the other side may feel justified doing the same. That reaction may come from anger, fear, or the belief that fairness no longer exists. And that is how retaliation starts masquerading as justice. That is how prosecutors begin chasing headlines instead of truth. That is how legal offices turn into political battlegrounds. And that is how the justice system risks sliding into full-scale political warfare. If that cycle ever takes hold, every administration becomes a target. Every decision becomes a vulnerability. Every mistake turns into ammunition. That is why Kennedy carefully introduced a more delicate issue, one many commentators avoid altogether. He alluded to visible weaknesses within the current administration, moments of confusion, public missteps, and decisions that appeared rushed or poorly managed. He did not make accusations. He did not state conclusions. He didn't need to. The implication was enough to underline his warning and reinforce how fragile legitimacy becomes once the line is crossed. He didn't accuse or speculate. He simply pointed out what millions of Americans already see with their own eyes. If prosecutors begin treating political weakness as a legal opportunity, that behavior doesn't stay isolated. It becomes the new standard. And once that standard is set, every future leader, no matter their party, faces a future filled with investigations, accusations, and legal threats the moment they leave office. Not because justice demands it, but because the precedent now allows it. Kennedy then turned his focus directly to the Department of Justice itself. He made a point to recognize the many honorable men and women who serve there every single day. Law enforcement officers who risk their lives. Prosecutors who go after real criminals. Analysts who quietly stop real threats before the public ever knows they existed. The majority of people inside the department, he emphasized, are professional, ethical, and committed to fairness, but Kennedy also made a hard truth clear. It doesn't take many bad actors to damage an entire institution. A small number of people can distort public perception, influence decisions behind closed doors, or quietly steer outcomes in ways the public never sees. And according to him, Americans have not been given a clear view of who has been pulling which levers over the past several years. He told Bondi directly that some individuals inside the Department of Justice have damaged its credibility. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to shake public confidence. Then he issued a challenge, not an attack. Identify the people who are doing their jobs with integrity. Remove those who are abusing their power. Restore the institution before the cracks grow too large to contain. Kennedy was not calling for revenge. He was not asking for retaliation. He was asking for fairness, for decisions based on evidence, not politics, for transparency instead of secrecy, for a justice system that remembers its purpose instead of drifting into partisan conflict. Because once legitimacy collapses, nothing stands firm behind it. The weight of that message landed heavily in the room. Not because Kennedy used dramatic language, but because the reality he described was already dramatic enough. He closed with a final warning. If the current path continues, America risks ending up with a justice system no one trusts. And once trust is gone, it is nearly impossible to rebuild. But he also made one thing clear. That outcome is not inevitable. The solution, while difficult, is straightforward. Restore fairness. Restore transparency. Restore legitimacy. And that responsibility does not belong to politicians alone. It belongs to the people inside the institutions who still believe in the rule of law and are willing to defend it. Now, the real question is no longer what Kennedy believes. The question is what comes next, and whether the system can correct itself before distrust becomes permanent. If you found this video insightful and want to explore more stories shaping the future of justice and accountability in America, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The next video goes even deeper, and you won't want to miss what comes next.